Hi, you guys. Welcome to week 19. We are off and running with the remainder of Jefferson's presidency. So last week, you'll recall we introduced the election of 1800 and another very controversial election. So the election of 1796 was a controversial one. That's when John Adams was elected, but because of the way they split the votes and because of Hamilton's intermeddling, we wound up with John Adams as president and Thomas Jefferson as vice president. Adams will only serve one term, so Washington served two. Adams will serve just one 4-year term as president, and then we have an election in 1800, and that will bring Thomas Jefferson into the presidency. But as you recall, both parties thought they'd kind of learned their lesson. And again, guys, understand when the Constitution was written, they were not necessarily anticipating political parties. So now we have them, even though Washington has discouraged us from forming them. And so we have Federalists and we have Democratic Republicans. And so in the election of 1800, thinking that they had learned their lesson, they said everybody has to, stay in line here. We all have to vote for the same two candidates so we don't wind up having a president, a vice president from two separate parties. So they did exactly that. And the Democratic Republicans won the day. But by sticking to the party line, they had a tie. Technically, even though everybody kind of knew that Aaron Burr was the vice presidential nominee, it nowhere said that legally. And so then that tie, according to the Constitution, gets tossed over to the House of Representatives to decide. And as we talked about last week, the House was still dominated by the Federalist Party because we hadn't changed out yet. So it was a Federalist Party-dominated House that now gets to decide who the Democratic Republican president will be. You see the problem here. Again, Hamilton got involved, and Jefferson was chosen or certified as the presidential candidate with Aaron Burr as his vice president. And then you'll also recall that caused such hard feelings that 4 years later, in 1804, it'll finally come to blows, and Hamilton and Burr will duel, and Hamilton loses his life in that duel. Okay, so that brings us kind of up to speed. Where are we in history? And I think that the first element that we talked about in Jefferson's presidency was that he inherited the Midnight Judges Act and the results of that. And so some of that had to be sorted out in the courts with Marbury versus Madison and just some of the fallout from Marbury versus Madison. The assertion of the federal judiciary that it had the right of judicial review. So guys, when you hear Marbury versus Madison, it should trigger in your mind that phrase, judicial review, that this set the precedent for the federal government having the right to review these decisions and make rulings about whether laws were constitutional. So Marbury versus Madison happens right there at the beginning of Jefferson's presidency. And then we mentioned the second significant event was the Louisiana Purchase. So that was where we left off last week, was with the purchase of the Louisiana Territory and the way that came to be. And today we're going to talk about the impact of that in American history. But before we do, let's just go to the Lord in prayer and ask him to bless our time. Father God, God, we love you for who you are. And God, we just acknowledge you right at this moment as the author of history, that it has been your hand moving throughout all of time that has brought these things to pass. And so, God, I pray that as we study the people and the events of this, tiny little slice of time, God, this tiny little piece of history, that as we study those things today, God, that you'll teach us things, that you'll shape our hearts to want to serve you, to look for your hand moving around us, to appreciate that, and to want to cooperate with it. I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, you guys, I'm going to launch into one of my favorite things to talk about, and that is the Lewis and Clark expedition. So first I want to introduce you to one of the key players, and that is Meriwether Lewis. So clearly the image up in the left-hand corner of Meriwether Lewis is him as an adult. much later on. But the message that I want you to get about Meriwether Lewis, here's another example. Just like John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg or Patrick Henry or George Washington, so many of these guys that we've talked about, we watch in his life and we see circumstances coming together in a way that they are not accidental. But when we look at them, if we don't look at them through God lenses, then it looks like, well, wasn't that lucky that all of these things kind of fell into place? I want to trace through some of those things with you right now. And I'm going to call this section the providential preparation of Meriwether Lewis. So I know you guys have probably heard of Lewis and Clark. We don't always know his first name, but it's Meriwether. So Meriwether Lewis, he was a Virginian. Not too far away from the Jeffersons, and he was born in 1774, so he's born right in the middle of the American Revolution. His father actually fought in the Revolution and very sadly died when Meriwether was just 5 years old. His dad had been home on leave, and he was returning to his unit, his military unit, and anyway, we don't have to get into all the details, but wound up dying in 1779 and left Meriwether Lewis an orphan at that point and his mother a widow. So American Revolution. That next little blank that I filled in for you is about his mom. So his father was a military guy. His mother was well known. Jefferson wrote about her. Some other folks wrote about her. She was known for very strong character, for dealing with tough situations in a very gracious and strong way. She also was known for her knowledge of herbs, and she would use those herbs to help heal people, to treat them for their illnesses. Very caring person, ministered to the sick often, also known for her extensive library, which was unusual at the time. So Meriwether Lewis, right from his childhood, has this exposure to a mama that's out there, digging in the dirt and teaching him about herbs and how they can be used medicinally. So that's going to be important. That's a little seed that's planted in Lewis's life that will bear fruit later on. His mom will remarry when he's still a little boy, and at about 8 years old, that man decided he wanted to relocate the whole family to Georgia, to a new settlement that was being formed there. So that was right towards the end of the American Revolution, right when the Treaty of Paris was signed. So Georgia's becoming a state, or an independent state now, and they moved to Georgia. And what happened is the stepfather and Meriwether Lewis went on ahead of the family. He was the oldest boy. They went on ahead of the rest of the family. And Lewis writes about this later on and says what an impression it made on him. He called it life on the frontier, this kind of rough and ready lifestyle. He liked the camping and the hunting and fishing and being out in the woods and just having to make do. So he really thrived in that environment, even as a little guy. And there's some neat anecdotal stories about, after the family then moved there, guys, they truly were still on the frontier, and they were dealing with native peoples and difficult circumstances. Well, at 9 years old, he was out in the woods. He'd gone hunting, and he was coming back towards where everybody lived or whatever. And several family members saw a bull start charging across the field. Guys, he's 9 years old. So some of you know 9-year-old boys. I want you to picture the 9-year-old boys you know. Most of them would not have had the presence of mind to this bull is just charging towards him. And Meriwether lifts his rifle and shoots the bull in mid-run, drops him. Then at 10 years old, their settlement was actually attacked by Indians. And so people they had to run off into the woods to survive. And so they're kind of out there camping out, hiding out in the woods. And one of the refugees lit a fire one evening, and the smoke gave away their position. So it's like dusk time, and it's just becoming dark when an Indian attack broke out there in the woods. So now not only have they been chased into the woods, but they're being attacked again. So there's all kinds of chaos. Men are rushing for their weapons. Women are scooping up children and trying to run them off into the woods. I mean, you can imagine the just terror of this moment. And again, the fact that a 10-year-old Meriwether Lewis does not get caught up in that, his presence of mind, his cool under pressure, is exhibited even then. So later the adults wrote how impressed they were that he had the presence of mind. He was the only one in the group that had the presence of mind to go and throw water on the fire, douse the flames, so that the Indians couldn't see where they were going. Like they lit up the whole scene, and it was easy for the Indians to pick them off. But he doused the flames so that they could run off into the woods and hide. So just two little examples there. Let me see if I can fill in some blanks for you. He loved life in the frontier country, hunting. Obviously, at 8 years old, this was when he first got to Georgia. He had to become familiar with weaponry, with knives, with all kinds of guns. Rifled, meaning a rifle means, guys, that the muzzle of that gun has a spiral down it, so it causes the bullet to rotate, to spiral, and to have more accuracy as it leaves the barrel of the gun, where a non-rifled musket, for example, would not have that and would have less accuracy. But anyway, he's going to learn to shoot with everything, and to hunt and to skin animals that he kills, and how to dress a carcass and all of that. All right, here's my two stories. At 9 was when he killed the charging bull, and then at 10 was when he had the presence of mind to douse the flames of that fire so that the settlers could escape into the woods. Now, at a very young age, again, we have his own letters, and it's pretty fascinating to read. At a really young age, he places a real value on education. He wants an education. He is seeking out who the best teachers and tutors are. He writes about hoping to be placed with Mr. Maury, M-A-U-R-Y. And eventually he is placed with Mr. Maury, but he has to spend a year or two with a tutor that he doesn't care for as much, but gets everything he can out of that guy, right? So I just think, again, and maybe write this in your margins, it just so speaks to his character that somehow early on it had been planted in him that the education wasn't something that you had to do and you checked the box. It was something that was really going to help him in life, and he sought out the best that he could. He wanted to suck everything he could out of those educational opportunities that he had. So he prized education. This is 13 years old that he's writing about this. He wrote frequently to his mother about trying to get in with the best teachers and tutors. He did just that, but he did have to forego his college education because at 18, the second husband, his name was Captain Marks, but the second husband passed away, which again left his mother a widow, and now she was in really not her home territory. So she'd been taken off to Georgia, with this man, and kind of reestablished her family there, but she longed to be back at home in Virginia, and they still had inherited land holdings. The Lewis land was still hers, and so, and the boys or whatever. So they longed to get back to Virginia. And she began to write. Again, we see those letters back and forth between mother and son where she is imploring him to come and organize a move of the whole family back to Virginia. So he leaves school to come and do that and to take over the management of the plantation back there in Virginia. Guys, he's only 18 years old when that happens. So they're back in Virginia, and that is in 1792. And if we're keeping track, we're right in the middle of George Washington's presidency at that time. So, in fact, we're just, let's see, there's an election going on, and he's going to be re-inaugurated in the spring of 1793. So 1792, Washington is president, and Meriwether Lewis is moving his family back to Virginia. Now again, guys, he had to step away from what he really wanted to be doing, which was pursuing education. He longed to go to William and Mary, the College of William and Mary, and now that opportunity would be denied him. Where he could have sulked and been very upset about this, he just simply plunges into that next challenge. But what he does do, I'm digressing a little bit, for the younger siblings, he makes it a priority that they have every educational opportunity and are able to go to college. Now, meanwhile, back at the ranch, back at the plantation, he is receiving a whole different type of really practical education, where that, again, would not have been his first choice. What he's getting is what he's going to need. He has no idea. There is no thought in his mind about exploring the West or anything like that at this point. But this is the preparation that the man, Meriwether Lewis, will need. So it was an education. Whoops, I forgot to fill in my blanks. Hang on. Okay, done all that. Oh, there we go. It was an education of a different type. A type he would desperately need for what he could never imagine was in his future. So at home, and he'd already had a good bit of this, but he has to become a master of these things. He has to learn about soil and crop rotation and which crops grow well where and all of that. He has to learn about blacksmithing. Now, does he have folks that can do that? Yes, but he needs to know too. He needs to understand it so he can supervise well. Coopering, all of these things were happening. Coopering, by the way, is barrel making. So fun fact for today. If you had the last name Cooper, you came from England, it's because you were a barrel maker. So coopering was barrel making. He's going to master the arts of skinning and tanning, smoking meats, repairing his farm equipment, and managing this very large staff of both free people and enslaved people that were there working on his plantation, as well as having to treat the sick. He was having to for the most part, there weren't professional doctors just making the rounds. And so for most things, he and his mother were the first line of defense in treating the sick. And so he became, somewhat an expert in that as well. I wanted to show you too, this is actually at Mount Vernon Estate. So this is if you were looking kind of out the window on the second floor. And this is similar to what you would have seen at the Lewis plantation. So as you look outside the house, you would have seen these other structures, and you'll see some of the smaller ones back here. Maybe this large one would have been a stable. You might keep a coach there or a wagon along with the horses. This might be a blacksmith shop, a smokehouse, a kitchen. Well, actually, at Mount Vernon, this is the kitchen here. But whatever, all these different buildings, and they have a name. They're called dependencies. So they're kind of dependent on the main house, but these dependencies were very common on large southern farms or plantations. That's kind of how you would see things set up. So it's like a little mini town that's going on there. And again, he's having to master all of the trades so that he understands them well and can supervise his workers well. As 1794 rolled around, so he's been at this now for 2 years, and Meriwether Lewis has now turned how old? 20. President Washington was beginning that. This is the year that he faces difficulty on the frontier with the Whiskey Boys, right? The Whiskey Rebellion is in full swing, and part of the problem out there, obviously, was this tax that was being imposed on whiskey. And I think I mentioned to you back when we talked about Washington that whiskey was not just something they drank. It was a currency. It was how they paid for things. And so this was really, it hit them very hard, these folks on the frontier. And I've just learned this, I'm going to tell you too, but part of the reason that they were so fired up is they felt like we're being taxed unfairly and we're not really receiving the benefits of the federal government. So this new little federal government thing that's been formed, and it's supposed to protect us. It says it's supposed to anyway, right? In the Constitution, but it's not. And we're being attacked. These were the frontier people, and they were being attacked by the Indians. Guys, violent, horrific things happening to their families, awful, awful things. And so that too is why they were so fired up about this. And the reason that they were suffering out there in Kentucky, etc., was because the main army, we had a very small core of military guys, because remember, there really wasn't a constitutional provision for a standing army. There wasn't a constitutional provision that said they couldn't. But anyway, that was a big debate right there at the beginning of our nation. And there were a lot of people that didn't want us to have a standing army. So that it was literally like at its max, about 5,000 people 5,000 men under George Washington's presidency. Well, that group of 5,000 were actually up in the Northwest Territory, because that's where some real hot spots of Native American conflict were. So they were all occupied up there. Meanwhile, our Whiskey Boys are left unprotected, and not only unprotected, but now taxed. All that to say, Lewis is 20 years old when Washington says, hey, I need some volunteers to go out to the frontier and deal with this whiskey rebellion because my military's all up in the Northwest Territory. And Meriwether Lewis was one of the men, who volunteered to serve under Washington. So he wasn't technically part of the Continental Army, what do we call that anymore, the American Army. He was not a commissioned officer in the regular Army. He was part of like a Virginia militia group, essentially, as a volunteer. So he goes, he serves there, and then he stayed. And he stayed as a volunteer to staff a fort out there on the frontier. And quite frankly, the military really got in his system, and he found that that was a perfect niche for him, that his talents, his character fit very well with a military lifestyle. And so he really desired to stay. And by this time, some of the younger siblings were able to step into more responsibility, and he was able to stay in the military. So I mentioned that to you, and major conflicts up in the Northwest Territory. And then he stayed on. Okay, this is kind of important too, guys, and I forgot to mention to you, but as always, pause me if you don't already, but make sure you have your highlighter. Because some of this stuff I'm just running my mouth and telling you, but you might want to hit certain parts that are really important with a highlighter. And I would say that this part that says the next year, when the Army was cut again, remember they got into that max number of 5,000. Well, again, there was this kind of move that said, oh, we don't want that large standing Army. We feel that's a threat to the independence of the states. And so they wanted to cut it down to 3,500 members. And Lewis had proven himself valuable enough to actually receive a commission in the regular Army by that time. So he is kept on as a regular Army officer in 1795. So again, this just speaks well of his character, his preparation, and the fact that military life seemed to be a really good fit for him. Now, he actually leaves that fort where he was assigned, and he moves up into, I said Ohio Territory, which it may have been specifically the Ohio Territory that was being carved out of the Northwest Territory. But it's there that we see this another, like people say, oh, isn't that just amazing coincidence? No, it wasn't coincidence. It was God ordained, a providential moment in Meriwether Lewis's life. And it happened again, as so often happens. Gosh, guys, I think we need to learn a lesson here. It happened out of a time of suffering. Again, something he never would have chosen. So, like when things don't go our way, probably our first thought needs to be, what's God doing? What's he preparing me for? Because his ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. They're higher and better and greater. So anyway, he is there serving up in the Northwest, and there's a guy in his unit that really doesn't like him, and he lodges these false charges against Meriwether Lewis that results in a court-martial, very serious. But at the end of the day, Lewis is found not guilty. Charges are dismissed. But his commanding officer realizes, I can't really send him back to the same unit with this guy because this is not a good situation. I'm going to transfer him. So he transfers him to a rifle unit. And that rifle unit is under the command of another Virginian. They have not met before, but they will meet now. And this guy is 4 years older than Meriwether Lewis, and his name is William Clark. That should ring a bell, right? So this is his providential first meeting with the man that will become his partner as they head out into the Louisiana Territory in just a few years. By all accounts, they were instant friends, had a great liking for one another immediately, but also a huge respect for one another and the talents and abilities that each held. And they were very different kind of people. So William Clark was just gregarious and outgoing and could be friends with anybody, where Meriwether Lewis tended to be a little more reserved and quiet and detail-oriented and that kind of thing. Now, Meriwether Lewis also probably, guys, had depression, suffered with bouts of depression throughout his life. So it's been written about a lot. His father, it seems from letters and accounts about his dad that his dad may have as well. So that just also is just kind of part of his story. And I think it's also encouraging to see how he overcame that and did not allow that to stop him from pursuing the things that he felt he was really wired to do. All right, so meets William Clark, and they are instant friends. They have great respect for one another. And again, I just go, oh, within 6 months, William Clark had to resign his position because there were things at home, some family responsibilities that needed his attention. So he wasn't dismissed or anything. He just simply felt that he needed to leave the Army and resign his commission. So the timing was just perfect for them to come together and to have 6 months of time together to get to know one another and see the strengths in one another. So now it's John Adams' presidency. And during that entire 4-year term, we see Meriwether Lewis continuing to kind of rise through the ranks in the military, doing very well. He takes a post, I think it might have even been called paymaster, and he reaches the rank of captain. His assignment was that he was to kind of be like a circuit rider. If you've heard of a circuit riding preacher, they have like a route that they do and they travel around to small churches. But his job was not to do that. He visited the forts, all these newly built forts that were popping up on the American frontier, because guys, we're fairly new going over the Appalachian Mountains, and we're going to have to defend that territory. And so these forts are popping up all out there, and he got the job of traveling from fort to fort to fort, distributing pay, but also then reporting back to his commanders about the conditions at the fort, any needs at the whatever. So bringing correspondence to and from, and then writing reports about the status of the defenses out on the frontier. And doing that, well, number one, I love this quote from him. He said it was the perfect assignment to satisfy what he called my governing passion for rambling. So again, like that, something that's just wired in him to like get out in the woods, right? We saw it at 8 years old, and here you see it in his 20s, that he still just has that real desire to get out in the woods, just go and be out in the wild frontier. In that job, he develops a reputation for strong character, honesty, fairness, thoroughness in his reporting, accuracy in his reporting. And I just put that as more providential preparation. And I'd like you to think for a second about how did that prepare him for what was to come? You can pause me if you need to brainstorm for a minute. So I would just say to you, if you need some help filling in blanks, that some of the things that did was it really honed his ability to record things well, to pay attention to details. His frontier living, he was having to camp outside a lot of the time and just make it happen, find food, and built his reputation. So within the military ranks, and these reports are going to Congress and all over the place. So his name is being circulated, and he's developing a really strong reputation, which led to his next big step. And that is that when Thomas Jefferson then was elected president in that famously tied election of 1800, he selected the then 26-year-old Meriwether Lewis to come and be his personal secretary. Now, I hadn't really put all this together. I knew that. Guys in the East Room, I didn't put pictures of it in here to this time, but I think we had them in last week's video. But the East Room was that room that you saw John and Abigail walking into with the big portrait of the president that hangs on the wall, the big life-size portrait, this one. So that's the East Room. And I knew that they had kind of built its cubicles in there so that the president had an office and Captain Lewis had an office right next door to him. So they had used the East Room as office space. But I really hadn't put together the fact that Jefferson was already widowed at this time. He had lost his wife back during the American Revolution. And so he had no family to bring with him. His children were all grown at this point and married and all that. And so he hires Meriwether Lewis, and the two of them move into the president's house, and it's this huge, drafty 23-room mansion with two bachelors banging around in there, And I love this quote from Jefferson. He says, "Captain Lewis and I are like two mice in a church." Like, it's pretty quiet around this place. And you should know, too, there was a huge age spread. So Jefferson at this time is in his 50s. I think he's 57 when he is elected president. But don't quote me on that one. But he's in his 50s. And Lewis is just 26 years old. But, guys, while, again, Meriwether Lewis was honored by the appointment to be the personal secretary for Jefferson, but the job itself, he writes about that too, and it's kind of one of the worst jobs he ever had, you know, because a lot of the tasks he described as menial and tedious. You can highlight that. Those, I think, are his words, tedious and menial. Because we don't have like copy machines or fax machines or anything at that time. So his job was to copy important correspondence, that if Jefferson needed to keep a copy, sometimes that was Lewis's job, was just to copy documents or copy reports that had been submitted and then send copies off to the people that needed them. So again, this wasn't his favorite job in the world, but it's preparing him for something. And what it did too was it put him in the right place at the right time. Because as you know the rest of the story already, but the Louisiana Territory is about to open. And here's this very capable, frontier-loving guy sitting in your office, sitting in the office of the president, the guy who's going to get to, you know, kind of choose who's going. And you have the most personal access that you could possibly have. Not only that, but he is meeting and listening to some of the most impressive minds in America at that time, and not just in America, in the world, so foreign visitors as well. Jefferson loved to entertain, and he prided himself on the food. Let's just think about, and maybe write in your margins, Jefferson prides himself on his dining table, and I don't mean the furniture. He loved to put together an interesting dinner party with experts in different fields that would spark interesting conversations. He loved fine food, interesting recipes, the best wines from Europe. So he loved that time of enjoying conversation and good food and good beverage. And I just think that sounds pretty delightful myself, to have that kind of an interaction going on. So Lewis was privy to that as this young guy. He's 26, 27, 28 years old, and he's sitting at the president's dining table and interacting with poets and philosophers and financiers and declaration signers and you name it, and hearing, you know, what they have to say. What do they know? What are they experts in? And so this is probably one of the best, again, just adds to his education, to his knowledge as he interacts with these folks. All right, providential preparation. The benefit was he got to listen to incredible people. Here's my little image I stuck in. This is actually the dining room at Monticello. So you can picture a Jeffersonian dinner party. Oh, that sounds fabulous. All right. This next quote comes from a wonderful book about the expedition. It's incredible background information. Okay, guys, it's not like reading, but it's wow. You would love this. If you're a reader, it's just full, and it's a page turner and fascinating. Maybe not the very first section. You don't love all the background on Jefferson, but dig in just a little bit to where, you know, how this expedition got underway, and then they take you all the way through it, and with lots of quotes taken directly from the journals of the expedition, and it's just amazing. So this is called Undaunted Courage. It's by Stephen Ambrose, and I highly recommend it. And on page 67, just a short quote, he says, "The president's house was the ideal finishing school for Lewis." You see, guys, Lewis didn't need to go to William and Mary. He needed to go to his plantation and to the military and to the president's house. That wasn't his plan. That was God's plan. Here at the president's house, as I mentioned before, he was exposed to the mind of Jefferson. He began to understand, like nobody else, what President Jefferson's priorities were. Jefferson made a point to put together these amazing, thought-provoking dinner parties, and Lewis was privy to all of those conversations. Now, Jefferson, at the time he entered office, even before that, was very interested in obtaining lands that were west of the Mississippi, west of where our treaty line was after the Treaty of Paris. Because again, it was kind of vast and uninhabited. You know, there weren't, no European nation had settled in that area. It was just this big, vast area that was kind of a political pawn on the chessboard. So, as you know, it traded hands. So it went into Spanish hands, and now in 1800 there was a treaty signed. That was where we left off last week. There was a treaty signed with France because they had a very powerful ruler at the time who was advancing all across Europe, and he kind of pressured Spain into giving it to him. So Spain signed over the Louisiana Territory to the French, and we in America went, now we're a little nervous because Spain was a nation on the decline. And we felt like we could work with them, that our access to the Mississippi and New Orleans was not threatened, no big deal. But France, kind of another thing altogether. Remember that we had not been getting along real well with Monsieur Talleyrand, right? With the minister, the prime minister of France, was the whole XYZ affair and wanting a bribe before he'd negotiate and messing around with our shipping and all of that. So we're a little nervous about what's happening over there now that France is taking possession. Now, I also learned something else this week. When France insisted on taking over the Louisiana Territory and Spain signed off, they set the date for 1803. I had assumed that they just did it in 1800 when they signed the treaty. But no, they set the date for the transfer to 1803. So while America was, we also knew, okay, we've got till 1803 to try to figure something out. And that's why it's under Jefferson's presidency that he's like, hey, guys, I'm going to see if I can't get Congress to authorize some money. And we need access to New Orleans. And y'all, you did your map this week, and you know the importance of New Orleans down there on the Gulf was that that's where the Mississippi River empties. And so all those farmers, all those frontier folks, if we're going to expand and we're going to grow America out into our western territories, we have to have access to the Mississippi River, and we have to be able to get out. So it doesn't do us any good to just be able to go up and down the Mississippi. We've got to be able to get our goods out for export. So that's why Jefferson's going to send somebody. He wants to negotiate with France about possibly the purchase of New Orleans or purchase of land that would grant us access to the Gulf that France controls. Oh, did I get ahead of myself? I did. So it's wild, but that's important for you to know. So you got that backstory. In the summer of 1802, and this is just a fun aside because I can just picture it. In the summer, they took a little vacation. So they'd leave Washington, D.C., because you could do that at that time. You didn't need to be there all the time because most of the time nothing was happening. Congress wasn't there. And so Jefferson and Lewis go to Monticello. And while they're at Monticello, this publication comes to them in the mail. And it's an account of this Scottish, but British adventurer named Mackenzie. And he had been exploring all these large parts of land kind of in western Canada all the way down to Seattle. So and mapping it all, because that was all kind of unexplored territory as well. So they get this whole report and maps and GPS, I was going to say, longitudes and latitudes and things from Mackenzie. And that lit a fire under Jefferson because suddenly he sees, and actually the Mackenzie expedition had taken place many years before. It's just that they're just now getting the evidence when it's published. So it comes into their hands, they read it, they just devour everything that Mackenzie had said about what he found and rivers and where he was and inlets and bays and whatever, what he encountered. And Jefferson's like, okay, that's it. The British are on the move up in that area, and if we don't get out there soon, we're going to lose all opportunity for America to make a claim on those lands. So his intention, the summer of 1802, was, hey, Meriwether Lewis, you're my guy. You are well prepared, your background in the military, all of your frontier experience, now the things that you've learned. So you're my guy, you're going to head this up. And I want you to be ready to go in essentially a year, a little under a year. So by summer of next year, I want you to be ready to take a group, a corps of men out and try to reach the Pacific and map all of that. And we need to put a claim on that territory. Now we'll have to get permission. And right now, what was beneficial to them was they could get permission from the Spanish, who were much more likely to give it than once the territory actually changed hands, right, and went into French hands. Okay, so that's in 1802. And they start plotting and planning and very excited. And Jefferson now has a project. All right, let me fill in some blanks. He decides by next summer, which will be 1803, that Lewis would venture into the Louisiana Territory to map and explore. All right. Knowing it's not ours and it's going to be France's, but maybe at some point, who knows what's going to happen with Napoleon and who knows what's going to happen with that Northwestern Territory, but let's just get out there. So we'll get a pass or a visa or whatever they call it from the Spanish to start trekking in 1803. So Jefferson now embarks on a regime of education for his new pupil, Meriwether Lewis, knowing what Lewis is now going to have to do. You guys know a little bit about Jefferson, right? And his expansive mind and his interest in just everything under the sun. So he has a natural interest in, archaeology, zoology, botany, astronomy, you name it. And so he knows Lewis is going to need this information in his brain. And so now comes like the data dump from Jefferson into Meriwether Lewis. They spend, night after night after night there at Monticello, walking the grounds, teaching how to use, like the astrolabe, how to find your location using this equipment that Jefferson had, how to use all kinds of things, measurement equipment, and delving into Jefferson's library and pulling out maps that Jefferson had access to. Guys, remember, again, this stuff is not as readily accessible today. We can click a button and look at anything that we want to see. But Jefferson had maps that nobody else had. And so they're looking at the existing maps of North America and what were the known geographical features and where do we think there are mountains out west, even though, best they knew, based on other explorers' previous notations. So they're studying North American geography, and I said this would have been an undergraduate degree, essentially, what he got in a few months from Jefferson. But they studied geography, botany, astronomy, mineralogy, geology, ethnology. Lewis will read from Jefferson's vast library, learn how to use the measurement and surveying equipment that he would need to use. And then Jefferson sends him off to Philadelphia, where there was a society, I think it's called the Philadelphia Philosophical Society. I should have looked that up for you. But that's an incredible group. You want to see some of the luminaries of early America, just look up that group. Benjamin Rush, of course, was a member, along with Charles Willson Peale. So these two guys take Lewis under their wings. And I put Charles Willson Peale's portrait in here just so you could remember who he was. Remember, this is the guy that Jefferson had sent off to that archaeological dig, and he was so interested in taxidermy and all of that. So Charles Willson Peale takes Meriwether Lewis and teaches him some things about basic taxidermy and zoology and other things that he would need to know, particularly related to animal life that he would encounter on his western journey. Then he also goes to Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush, I don't know how much I've talked to you about him. What an amazing man. Again, write in your margin if you need to. Dr. Rush was a signer of the Declaration of Independence from Philadelphia, and he was a physician, and he trained many of America's first generation of, us as a nation. Of course, we've been here for a while, but kind of formal education for our doctors, medical doctors. Not only that, but he was an extremely strong Christian. He wrote on all kinds of things. So I will put a link this week on your website just in case you want to look up a little something on Dr. Benjamin Rush. If you ever have to write about a character from colonial America, he's another really great one to dig into. So he was a reformer, meaning that he wanted to change the way we treated the mentally ill. He also was one of the founding members of the American Bible Society and had very strong opinions about the importance of the Bible in the education of the young, and wrote extensively on why it was mandatory that it must be used as a school book in our school system. So also very interesting to read what he had to say. But Dr. Rush is known as a premier physician. He's on the cutting edge of what we knew at that time. And so Dr. Benjamin Rush will work with Meriwether Lewis. And he had developed a patented pill. And I think it was actually called Dr. Rush's bilious pills. But they got the nickname Russia's thunderclappers. Because, guys, they created some thunder down under, meaning that they were a laxative, a very powerful laxative that had toxic mercury in it. It was about half of what the pill was made up of. And it did help to detox people. So it often did help people, but it was a pretty dramatic effect that it had. That's how, of course, it got its nickname, Russia's thunderclappers. Well, he learns about other things as well, treating other things and how to do stitches and whatever else he needed to know. But he ordered 1,300 doses of Russia's thunderclappers to take with him on the trip. Now, I mentioned key ingredients was mercury. Now, that becomes an important little thing. This is just a fun fact. Mercury is toxic. You really don't want to ingest it. And, however, it doesn't really absorb into your system. Like from the pill they were taking, probably not much would absorb into their system. Most of it passed through their system, and mercury is an element that does not break down over time. And so historians have actually been able to pinpoint the exact locations of some of the Corps of Discovery campsites because of the presence of large amounts of mercury in certain areas. Y'all follow? That they essentially had toxic waste, and they've been able to track where that was. So maybe I'll link that to our website this week as well. I better make some notes about what I'm supposed to link. Hang on, let me pause you. In 1803, within 6 days of each other, Jefferson had requested both of these things, but Congress will approve bills that allocated $2,500 for the exploration of French Louisiana Territory and $10 million to negotiate for the purchase of New Orleans from the French. We've covered this before, and I think I've already now said this class, but it's in January of 1803 that Jefferson actually sends these diplomats over to France to negotiate for New Orleans before Spain formally turns it over to France. And then it's just a few months later in April 1803. Remember that Meriwether Lewis is supposed to go in April of 1803. I think it technically still would have been Spanish hands at that point. We're going to see that he gets delayed, so he doesn't actually leave till later than that, but he's supposed to go in April. Instead, in April, what does happen is that there's a treaty signed over there by which we would purchase the entire Louisiana Territory. Again, guys, dates get kind of interesting here because word is not out on the street about this until July 4th, 1803. That's when it's announced publicly that the Louisiana Territory will be purchased, or that the treaty has been approved, it's in the process of approval by the Senate. And it's actually in October. It's going to take a little while, probably because the states wanted to give instructions to their senators about that. And so it's not until October 1803 that the treaty becomes ratified. But by that time, Lewis and Clark are actually on their way. So even though they've been delayed past April, by the time it's ratified in October, the land is ours. Okay. But all right, even in August when they go, everybody knows it's about to be, but it's just not formalized until all the states ratify, until the Senate ratifies that treaty. Okay. If I didn't confuse you with that. Let's see, we'll move me down here. This was just to remind you of kind of where things stood at the time. So right here is where the Mississippi River, so right where the purple and the gold meet right there, is where New Orleans is located. So this was very, this is what it was all about. That's what the negotiation was all about. $10 million just to buy access, right, to the Gulf of Mexico. And then, of course, as you know, France comes back and says, well, for $15 million, you can have all of this. And that was a deal worth taking. So we did. So you can also see the impact, though, on the land mass that made up the United States of America. So we more than doubled with the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase. All right. I filled that in. Okay. Now, because of that, again, when they first start planning and he's going to Philadelphia to study with Benjamin Rush and with Charles Willson Peale, Lewis's mission was a little different. It was supposed to be mostly about exploration and mapping and unusual things that he would find, scientific in nature, philosophical in nature. Now, it is not only an exploration, but it's a mission of diplomacy, because now we have Native American peoples that are living out there, and they have a new landlord, if you will. I don't know how else to describe that, but it's no longer Spain, and maybe they'd heard it was going to be France that controlled this territory, but it's now the United States of America. So it becomes Meriwether Lewis and William Clark's job to go and present themselves and to maintain good, peaceful, harmonious relationships with the native peoples that they meet. So some new challenges are going to be placed before them as they move across this new territory. And also, it becomes really important to know what's out there because it belongs to us, and to map it and understand it so that Congress can act on what they find, so that we can actually, the states and Congress can do something with this information. So it's not just for interest's sake anymore. It's really of vital importance to the future of the United States of America. His job is to develop the relationships with the native peoples and encourage key chiefs to go to Washington, D.C. to meet with Jefferson. He brings, I should have put images of this in there, but there are peace medals that are struck. They're fairly large, like this big, with images of Thomas Jefferson's head on them. And those are presented to those people that they assess, that they determine are very key leaders in the various tribes, and they're to ask these folks, through interpreters of course, to go to journey to Washington with them. And many of them do, you guys, so those records are really fascinating too. When these folks go to Washington, D.C., I think it's I can't remember what year it was, but when the Mandan chief goes with William Clark, they traveled back down the Missouri together. He brings one of his wives, and they go to meet Thomas Jefferson. All right, I digress. The actual trip, right? Lewis is supposed to leave in April of 1803. He is so frustrated, you guys, and that's some of the stuff that you'll read about in here is, like, what did it take to actually get out of town? Think about when you're planning for a trip and trying to go somewhere. Now think that it's kind of more than that. This was more like a mission to the moon. They don't know what to expect out there. So not only we're having to pack and prepare for a large group of people, it will turn out to be 33 people in what they call the Corps of Discovery, and that's what Lewis names them. But to plan for all these folks, food, alcohol was really important. If you had a military expedition and you had no alcohol for these guys, but Lewis famously says, I'm paraphrasing, I just have to have enough alcohol to last until there's no turning back, till we reach the point of no return. I got to keep them going long enough. But he's got to pack that. He has to pack, medicinal things, and then all of what he'll need to send back samples back to the east. He's got to have paper. It's so interesting to see what he did pack, what he knew he would need. He'd need lots of ink and quills and paper, because his job was to write stuff down, right, and to map things. He's going to spend a ton of his budget on hog's lard. And we look at that today and we're like, what in the world? Is it like to cook with? Or no, guys, mosquitoes were a huge issue for them. I mean, like, could absolutely torment you to death. Swarms like you can't even imagine. And so the only way that you could kind of survive and press on was to cover your whole body in this hog lard that they couldn't bite through. He also spends lots of money on mosquito netting and that kind of thing as well. We know about the 1300 Rush's thunderbolts or thunderclappers. And along with lots of, so anyway, just think about what it must have taken to plan and to have everything that he thought he would need to survive. And guys, you have to give this guy a ton of credit. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but we'll just fill in the blanks when we get there. But he takes 33 people out, and he brings 32 back. And the one that he doesn't bring back died of a burst appendix. There was nothing he could have done about that. And so, the fact that he prepares so well for them really speaks volumes again about the preparation Meriwether Lewis for this job. But all that to say, some of the things he's asking for are like custom made. For example, this boat is his keel boat, and that in itself is really interesting to see, like his design for it, how he wanted it done, and the guy that was working on it just, you know, it seemed like the classic government contractor just could not get the job done. And so he harangues him and fusses at him, but he's the only guy, and it takes him a long, long time to get that keel boat finished. But you see the construction of it, and it was designed to be rowed or to be poled. So if you were going upstream, having to fight the current, then guys could actually walk right along. There were these two platforms that were built into the sides here, so that men could walk along the sides with poles to push. They would just walk, and then replant their pole. And you'll see in the movie. I'm going to have you watch. So it was designed to go both upstream or downstream. It could sail or be rowed. And so pretty innovative stuff. That image that you see in your notes, number one, that's a photograph of a replica. And then these are the actual designs that Lewis himself drew for the keelboat. So it takes a long time for the keelboat to get done, a long time for his other supplies to be gathered, but it was really the keelboat that really hung him up. And so it's not until August 31st of 1803, and it's literally 3 hours after the contractor gets the last nail in this thing that he's like, load it up, we're out of here. So it just kind of shows you how he was chomping at the bit, ready to go. He heads down the Ohio River. He's going to have to hit the Ohio, I think the Mississippi, and then get to the Missouri. And the Missouri is what's going to take him west. But guys, they're going to be going upstream for miles and hundreds of miles. They have to go upstream, and it's a very strong current that they're fighting. It's misery. They will strike out. He and Clark will decide to winter just outside St. Louis, so that's as far west as they get in 1803. They spend the winter, and then they actually strike out with their Corps of Discovery, well-trained, ready to go, on May 14th, 1804. So it's now been 2 years since we started training in the backyard at Monticello. What Jefferson had hoped would be a launch date of summer 1803 turns out really to be May of 1804. Lewis, his job on the trip is he's basically the primary scientist. He's the diplomat, while Clark is the logistics guy. He's drawing maps. He's a master boatman, so he's commanding the crew most of the day and working. He's actually on the river, while Lewis, most days, is walking along shore. Sometimes that's up on a high bluff. He wanders to and fro. The reason he has so much time to do that is because these guys sometimes, I mean, they average 10 to 15 miles a day. That's throughout the whole trip. The first half, when they're going upstream, it's a lot less than that they're averaging. Sometimes just 1 or 2 miles a day. That's all they can make, fighting that current, getting through falls and rocks and things like that, having to pick things up and carry them, and it's just crazy. So that's why Lewis is able to literally keep up with them, walking along the shore, making observations, going off to explore, hunting, collecting specimens, and all that kind of thing. So that is the summer of 1803 into the winter of 1803. Few important moments just to know about. Again, in the providence of God, Lewis is able to save himself just a few days after they leave. They take off. He falls off a cliff and is able to save himself by plunging his pike head. You'll see the images over here. He didn't actually, I think, have his on a pike. I think he carried this thing. It's called an S-pontoon, but you typically see it attached to the end of this long wooden spear-looking thing. So it looks like a dagger, kind of, but he called it his S-pontoon because that's what it was, and he carried that with him always. And he was literally kind of sliding down a cliff, a 90-foot drop, and was able to plunge that thing into the side of the cliff and save himself and pull himself back up to safety. So there was that. Could have been bad. May 23rd, 1804. And then it was August 1804 when Sergeant Floyd passed away from the burst appendix. I said providentially, he is the only casualty of this incredibly dangerous trip with 33 people. It is, as I mentioned, slow, difficult work. They're having to go upstream. They covered almost 8,000 miles in the 2.5 years that they are gone. That's not all on water. Guys, they also have to cross the Rocky Mountains on horseback. Unbelievable. Just just unbelievable. It would be overwhelming to get that far and to think that you just had this kind of narrow, because they don't know. And so to be exhausted and you think you're so close and we just have to get over this little mountain range, just this little narrow strip of mountains and we'll be good. And then to see the expanse of those steep, difficult Rockies stretching before you that you've got to make on horseback would have been pretty demoralizing, but they did it. So they spend the winter of 1804. They get several miles, obviously, down the road, down the river. And in 1804, 1805, you have to stop. You can't keep traveling. Too cold, too snowy, too ice-locked to move. And so they winter with two tribes that kind of live side by side, the Mandans and the Hidatsas. And these are friendly to them, guys that are very friendly to them. And in fact, Lewis spends much of the winter doctoring their people. So it builds really great relationships with the people. And while they're there at the Mandan villages, they actually live with the Mandans and the Hidatsa. Some Hidatsa folks come across the rivers. Mandan is your other tribe name. While they're there, there's some folks that come across the river, including this Frenchman named Toussaint Charbonneau. And he is a French-Canadian trapper. He's living with the Hidatsas, and he's serving as an interpreter for them. Or excuse me, I'm sure he does interpret for them, but he's living with them. And he had married two women that he won in a card game. And those two women were young women who had been captured by the Hidatsas from a rival Indian tribe, the Shoshones. So those two women, one of those women was Sacagawea. And she was a young Shoshone girl when she was captured. She was brought back to the Hidatsa tribe, where she was basically won as a wife and became wife to this Toussaint Charbonneau. Well, at the time that Lewis and Clark arrive, Charbonneau comes across, brings Sacagawea, and they realize that he volunteers. He wants to go with them and serve as their interpreter, saying, I know some of the tribes, I know some of the way, I can be helpful to you. He's looking for a job. Well, what they think could be most helpful to them is the fact that his wife is a Shoshone, and they've heard that the Shoshone people have horses, and the Shoshones live very near to the Rockies, and that they'll need to negotiate. They can't bring all these horses with them. They're going to have to trade and obtain horses that way. And so they're very motivated to bring Sacagawea with them to help them negotiate with the Shoshone, speak to them, and obtain the horses that they'll need. So the agreement is struck. Sacagawea actually really wants to come. Needless to say, she wants to get home and she wants to see her own people. So she will go with them, Sacagawea. You may have heard her name Sacagawea, but the more accepted pronunciation today is Sacagawea. And interestingly, she is a very young woman at the time, and she is expecting a baby. And so Meriwether Lewis actually is her midwife. He delivers that little baby that winter, and his little baby's name is Jean-Baptiste. Of course, Sacagawea is going nowhere without him, and so little Jean-Baptiste will be strapped to her back, and he will go with them. He is the youngest member of the Corps of Discovery. It's also pretty impressive to think about Sacagawea in those boats through the rapids. I mean, we have, she saves their stuff time after time. Stuff gets dumped over into the river, and she's gathering it all up and getting it back in the boat. And she is helpful to Meriwether Lewis in identifying local plants and things that can be eaten and used by them for medicines. She knows her way around. She recognizes landmarks. She is absolutely instrumental to the success of this expedition. I stuck this map in here just so you could get a view of kind of how far they went, you guys. Just remarkable. And especially when you think about the fact that there were no maps. They didn't know what to expect. They had to just get the best information they could from the native peoples and interpret it best they could and keep going. I mean, there would be places where the river would fork and they go, okay, well, they said that we should see a falls, when we get about, so far up, and they just have to strike out and hope for the best. So The red line, yeah, the red line is their journey out to the Pacific coast. And then the blue line indicates the return trip. And so you'll notice right here that the blue line splits. And that's because purposely Lewis and Clark split so they could cover more territory, with the idea being, and we're all going to meet back up at the Mandan villages at such and such a date. So it all worked out amazingly. And then their return to St. Louis. Just a couple other things to tell you about their trip. They nearly lose the same guy. He's the youngest member of the Corps of Discovery. He's 19 when they leave. His name is George Shannon. And again, the stories are just kind of fun in here. So he gets separated from the group twice, and both times very dangerous, but once, I mean, that close to dying. He had been separated from them for 16 days when they are able to finally track him down. The problem is he got ahead of them, so they had to actually send somebody out, finally realizing maybe he got ahead of us instead of catching up to where we were. So they find George Shannon, and George Shannon does grow up to become a very good attorney, well-respected attorney in early America. So it wasn't for lack of brains that George Shannon got lost. There's another wonderful story later on in the trip where one of the Frenchmen that was along before the part of the Corps of Discovery, very reliable guy, Cruzat was his name, and he and Meriwether Lewis were out hunting, and Cruzat mistakenly shot Meriwether Lewis, shot him right in the behind, right in the hindquarters. And so that took a while to get over that. But again, I mean, I laugh about it. It's a little humorous on this side of things. It didn't do any permanent damage, but it certainly could have, and could have been the end of that trip. So many other stories are recorded in here. Guys, just remember, they're seeing plants and animals they've never seen before. And they're seeing even animals that they might be familiar with, they're seeing them in abundances like they've never encountered. Like Meriwether Lewis talks about a certain flock of birds that comes over that literally there's so many of them that it blackens the sky. There's no light. It like blocks the sun because there's so many birds in this flock. I want to see that. They've never encountered a grizzly bear before. This gigantic, 16-foot thing that stands up on its hind legs and is not afraid of you one bit. And that oftentimes one shot will not take out. And guys, we don't have revolvers or automatic weapons. So this grizzly bear is a huge threat to them, and is, written about quite a lot. They have several encounters with grizzlies. And again, remarkable that no one is killed. They discover all these little barking animals, the cute little barking animals that come up out of holes in the prairie. Well, prairie dogs, they've never seen these before. And Lewis so wants to take one or send one back to Philadelphia as a sample, but they can't catch them. It's kind of like playing whack-a-mole out there on the prairie. And finally, they have to haul up all these buckets of water to flush one out of his hole so they can capture him, send him back. So prairie dogs, and buffalo. The first time, again, they just hear this amazing rumbling sound like they've never heard before, and come kind of up over the ridge. They come up from the river over the ridge, and they see like thousands of buffalo moving across the plain. Can you imagine? And they learn to have a real appreciation for the buffalo because, of course, the native peoples do, and they learn how important those buffalo robes are and the meat and every part of that animal for survival. All right. One more little story about this Lewis and Clark expedition. There comes to be a very crucial point in the trip, again, where they are transitioning from boats. They've reached what's called the Continental Divide. That might be worth writing in your margins. So, guys, the Continental Divide is the highest point on the continent where the Rocky Mountains peak. And so rivers flow eastward on one side of it and westward on the other. And so they reach that point. They find the Continental Divide. But when we approach the Continental Divide, we know that we're going to need horses. We have to abandon the water because the water is getting narrower and narrower and narrower as it approaches its source. So we have to abandon the boats, and we have to get on horses to cross through the mountains. And so that's where they're in need of the Shoshone people. And Sacagawea is recognizing landmarks and things, but they are not seeing anybody. And it's getting closer and closer to winter. They're getting very concerned about, even surviving if they do not find them in a few, short days. They need to locate the Shoshones. Finally, Lewis and Clark split up. Lewis goes on ahead to try to find them, and he does. I don't know exactly. He doesn't have many men with him, but very, very small party with Lewis. The rest are all with Clark, including Sacagawea. So Lewis is trying to delay until Clark can catch up to them at their meeting point that they've kind of established. And he says he's going to be coming. He's going to be coming. And this chief, the chief's name is Kamehameha. And Kamehameha doesn't want to wait. Kamehameha fears that this is really a trap, and that this white man who he's never seen, he may never have seen a white man, but this guy, he really thinks he's probably allied himself with one of the Shoshones' enemies, and he's not necessarily understanding everything he's saying because they can't speak the same language, so it's just all sign language and trying to communicate. There's some really interesting accounts of how Lewis is able to reassure him. He actually at one point gives the chief his rifle and says, look, trust me, nobody's coming to attack you. You take the rifle. And he notices at one point that the chief is they act like they're giving him gifts, but he notices, oh, they're putting all this stuff on me, so I look like one of them, because they think that we're about to be attacked, and that way I'll get attacked too. And so there's a real funny account of how he starts handing him his tricorner hat and some of his outfits, and they basically are, exchanging clothing here, waiting for William Clark. Anyway, Clark finally arrives, and there is Sacagawea and Toussaint Charbonneau, the rest of the crew, and they sit down to negotiate for these horses with the Shoshone. Oh, I told you all that. Okay. The way this is going to have to work is pretty complicated. We have to go from Shoshone, so Kamehameha will speak, but now Sacagawea is present. So she'll be able to go from Shoshone into Hidatsa, because remember she lived with the Hidatsa, she was captured by them. So she can go from Shoshone to Hidatsa. Then her husband, he lives with the Hidatsa also, but he's native French. So he can go from the Hidatsa language and translate it into French. And then we have this young man who's along for the trip, and his name was Private Francis Labiche. Labiche can then translate the French into English. So we're going to have 3 people involved, actually 5, because we start with Kamehameha, and it's got to go through 3 different mouths before it gets to Lewis and Clark. After they're trying to get organized, they all sit down to start this process, and after just a minute of talk, Sacagawea recognizes Kamehameha. She realizes that it is her brother. It's the brother she hasn't seen since she was taken by the Hidatsas. She just is overcome with emotion and tears, and they embrace. And guys, that wary chief, the one that wasn't sure about Lewis and Clark, the guy that holds the key to the success of their mission, was won over in that moment by the providential presence of Sacagawea. Over and over again, secular writers will have incident after incident where they go, well, weren't they lucky? And look at another instance of extraordinary luck. But you and I know better. There is no such thing as luck. If we truly believe, and we say we do, that God is sovereign, and He's sovereign over it all. My last little comment on this was that the trip was far more arduous than any of them had anticipated or could have planned for, and it took a lot longer. So again, it kind of adds to the suspense and the drama of the whole thing. It's just this amazing story, but pretty much everybody had given up hope, because once you get too far out, there's no sending mail back anymore. So the last time that they had sent anything back was from the Mandan villages in the winter, like the spring of 1805. So they had spent the winter 1804, 1805 there. But that's the last time. And now that was pretty fascinating, because, again, Lewis spends the winter, as I mentioned, doctoring people, but he's also preparing all these specimens that he's gathered, and he sends this boatload of stuff back to Charles Willson Peale, which is a bunch of the stuff that wound up in his museum, all this taxidermy and plant samples and rocks and horns that he'd collected and whatever, nuts and berries and stuff. So he sends back all that stuff. But now they haven't had communication with anybody since then. And so the rest of the world really has given them up for dead. They think they're done. They're gone. Because it's taking so long. It's 2.5 years. And so no one's expecting them until they come sailing into St. Louis. Man, what a reception that must have been. Their favorable reports about the opportunities in the West, about what was out there in the West, along with those of another early explorer named Zebulon Pike. That's who Pike's Peak is named after. So their reports, along with those of Zebulon Pike, will encourage Western settlement in this new territory. And now it is no longer the Louisiana Purchase, it is the Louisiana Territory. You all remember that that's how land becomes part of the United States, is by first becoming a territory, then being split up into smaller territories that then have territorial governments and move towards statehood. So we have this huge now tract of land that's the Louisiana Territory. Kind of interesting, the first territorial governor of the Northern Territory of Louisiana is, surprise, surprise, Meriwether Lewis. Another little quick postscript, just fun thing to know. The little boy, the little infant guy that Meriwether Lewis delivered, his name was Jean-Baptiste. But William Clark pretty quickly nicknamed him Pomp. So Pomp was along for the ride, right? The whole thing, this little tiny guy did. He was only, 2 years old when they complete this trip. So Pomp will grow up, and I'm trying to think, what year would they have returned? 1806? Yes. And so the very next year, 1807, the Charbonneau family, including Sacagawea and the baby, make their way to St. Louis to come and visit William Clark. And while they're there, they decide to stay, and they're going to stay for 2 years. But in 1809, the mom and dad want to head back. They decide they want to go back to the Hidatsa village. And they leave little Jean-Baptiste, little Pomp, with William Clark, and he raises him as his own. He has a really interesting life, so his is another kind of really interesting story to read. He travels in Europe, he does all kinds of stuff that he probably never could have imagined, sees things he never could have dreamed of. For a little half native, half French boy, he saw more of the world than probably anybody had at that time. And then he winds up in California when the gold rush begins. He goes out as one of the gold rush guys he becomes a 49er and goes out to California and almost ends his days there. But anyway, just little interesting side stories. And then a little bit more about Pike too. Zebulon Pike is like 5 years younger than Meriwether Lewis, but they come into the Army at the same time, or they volunteer. They both volunteer for George Washington. It's just that Zebulon Pike was 15 years old when he volunteered, and then he winds up staying and serving in the Army too. So Zebulon Pike, I feel bad for the guy because he kind of gets lost in the shadow of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. But he too was an amazing explorer, and his accomplishments are worth studying. It's just that we don't have time to dig into all of it in great detail. This is a quick little map showing you kind of his route down the Mississippi over into the Southwest, then making his way up into modern day Colorado and Pikes Peak, and then back to St. Louis. And that was, as you see, the year after, or I'm sorry, the year that they returned, 1806, that he made his trip. Now, there are a couple good movies out there that you can find. So you can find these on Netflix or Amazon Prime. National Geographic, Lewis and Clark, Great Journey West. If you have access to it, I think it was on, I can't remember, y'all, Netflix or Amazon Prime, with one of them. So if you have access to it there, that might be the best place quality-wise to watch it. The Ken Burns series on Lewis and Clark, The Journey of the Coral Discovery, is interesting, but to me, this one's more exciting. I don't want to say that he makes it sound boring, but I feel like he kind of sucks the life out of it because it's so documentary in style. So I don't just love the PBS version, but part of your homework this week is to watch the National Geographic one. And I just feel like they pull more scenes in that help it come to life for you, and you see what it's really was like. All right, enough about Lewis and Clark. We're going to move on to the Barbary Pirates. So the story of the Barbary Pirates. Oh, wait. Almost forgot. I already mentioned to you Undaunted Courage, the story of Lewis and Clark. But for a shorter and just as compelling version, there is a young people's version of Courage Undaunted by James Doherty. And guys, it's definitely doable, and it's going to really still get the point across for you. And, well, very well done. Worth reading. Not a kid book, okay? This one might be more, but it's still really, really good. Like, I enjoyed it. So this is called The Captain's Dog, My Journey with Lewis and Clark, with the Lewis and Clark Tribe. It's by Roland Smith, and it's the story of a dog that Lewis purchased in St. Louis and took with them on the trip and made it all the way back, and his name's Seaman. So you're kind of seeing the trip through Seaman's eyes. So 3 great recommendations if you want to read a little more on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Okay, on to Barbary Pirates. Now, we introduced them last week, so I'll go quickly through some of the background stuff. You know, ever since America had gained her freedom, our merchants were suffering at the hands of what I will describe as state-sponsored Muslim terrorists. That's a term we actually use today, but it applies to what was happening then. Guys, what that means, state-sponsored Muslim terrorists, means the government is in on it. They're supporting this. And that is what we are dealing with in today's world right now. And it is coming largely from the same places, so along the northern coast of Africa. It's coming from other places as well, but still in place along the northern coast of Africa. In those days, that area was called the Barbary Coast. So I know I popped a map in for you last week, but all of this area here, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, were called the Barbary Coast. Now, if you know a little bit about your Mediterranean area geography, you know that there's this very narrow strait. You see where it looks like Spain is touching Morocco. It's this very narrow little passageway there called the Straits of Gibraltar. Well, because it's so narrow, you can target ships as they come through. It's a toll booth, is what they kind of turned it into. Well, the European powers had just been paying these guys off. It became more beneficial to them to just pay essentially a bribe. Excuse me one second. So they were doing it. They were paying tribute to these Barbary states and to the leaders of the Barbary states. But America, previously, we had flown under British flag. We were protected kind of by their payment. Now we're not. And so it was, open season on American merchant ships. So tribute is your blank there. And most of the money was going to the nations of Morocco, Tunis, Algiers, and Tripoli. Tripoli was a nation at that time. Today it is not, but there is still a city of Tripoli, capital of the nation of Libya. All right, for many years, Americans paid what they could, but many men and ships were seized. The sailors were sold into slavery or held for astronomical ransoms. The Pasha of Tripoli, that was the title of their leader, a man named Yusuf, was incredibly brash. And in 1799, so we're in the Adams presidency, he demanded a $225,000 bonus payment. We'd already paid our tribute for the year, but he said, oh, well, George Washington has died, and it's customary to make a large payment in memory of great men. Guys, this was just, we had no way to get out of this. Anything they demanded, we wound up having to pay because we were weak in their eyes. We couldn't defend our own people. And so if we wanted to keep our guys from being seized and put into slavery and our ships from being taken, that was the only option that we had. Well, that same year, 1799, the American Congress had already paid out more than $2 million in tribute to the pirates. Our government was using the people's money to pay bribes to Muslim state-sponsored terrorists. And it was mounting up year by year. More and more was demanded. At this point, it was 20% of the total federal government budget was being spent on tribute to the Barbary Coast. Problem. Because where's the end of that? And it's so interesting to me, again, we talked about this last week, but just the dichotomy that this was the same president that was saying millions for defense, but not a cent for tribute. And yet that's what we were doing with these guys. So we needed a good defense system, and that Adams will start that. He becomes, as you know, the father of the American Navy, and under Jefferson, we're going to have enough of a Navy to go after these guys. So Jefferson's had enough. You've already had this background. I think I put it in last week's notes as well, kind of, why these guys refused to negotiate, because they said, you're infidels, and that excuses any behavior. We don't have to honor our treaties with you. So Jefferson goes back to the rallying cry of the people when Adams refused to pay X, Y, and Z. So Jefferson's rallying cry, once again, is millions for defense and not a cent for tribute. So he picks up that slogan, but now he's aiming it at the Barbary States. He sends about 4 frigates and several smaller ships to confront these Barbary nations. Our American Navy is victorious in several battles, and they convinced the Moroccans, which were our first target, to cease their attacks, and now they head for Tripoli, one of the problem places. And there, one of our ships, a frigate called the Philadelphia, ran aground and was captured, along with all 307 crew members. The crew members were immediately enslaved. The Barbary States are not happy that we are trying to negotiate by force, and so all 307 men were immediately put into slavery, and in fact many of them were used to shore up the defenses of Tripoli, the city itself. So our American guys, our sailors, were having to actually build up defenses against their own men who were coming to attack. At that point, a daring secret raid was planned. As the gleeful Tripolitans, so these Tripoli pirates who had captured the Philadelphia, now worked to kind of there's a word for it, that they were refurbishing the ship and renaming it. They had already renamed it, rather, the Gift of Allah. So that's kind of a slap in the face to America. We had a young lieutenant. He was in his 20s at the time, 24, 26 years old, and his name was Stephen Decatur, and he volunteered to lead the charge. This daring secret raid was to actually come into the port of Tripoli, where they had hauled the Philadelphia, now renamed the Gift of Allah, and his commander had said, we can't afford for them to have that ship. So if you can, see if you can't go in and do what you can to haul it back out, to tow it out. Well, that probably seemed a little unlikely, given the heavily reinforced fortresses there at Tripoli in the port, in the harbor. He said, but if all else fails, try to set fire to it and destroy it so that it doesn't fall into the hands of the enemy. So Stephen Decatur volunteered to lead this mission. So they go in a much smaller ship, and all of his American guys are down kind of underneath, below decks, and hiding under tarps and that kind of thing. And they come into the port. And guys, picture like the harbor at St. Augustine, the little bay there where all the ships come in. It's little. It's very small. Okay. So they come in, and they have these guys with them that speak Arabic. And so those guys are calling out to the harbor master in Arabic, and they're explaining they lost their anchor, and they're going to need to anchor up to another ship, which I guess is what you did. And so they just kind of start heading over towards the Philadelphia, and they're yelling, oh, we're going to anchor over here. We're going to tie up to the Philadelphia, to the Gift of Allah. We're going to tie up over there. And so nobody's really that suspicious, and they go ahead and tie up over there next to the Philadelphia. At that point, Decatur yells, board! And there were probably 20 Tripolitans that were still aboard the ship, aboard the Philadelphia, and all of them were taken out. So there's this massive battle that breaks out on the deck of the ship, sabers and hand-to-hand combat. There are no firearms, because they were hoping they could do this quietly, and they did do it quietly, fairly quietly. They don't alarm the town. But they pretty quickly realized that they're not going to be able to tow this thing back out, that it's too disabled and it's too heavy for the smaller ship that they're on to tow it out of the harbor. And so the men have been very organized. Decatur had them very organized into little teams that were supposed to go to different parts of the ship. And he says, okay, well, it's time to set fire, so go ahead and set your parts on fire. They stay on board long enough to be sure that the fire is going and cannot be put out. And at that point, though, it becomes obvious something's going on the ship. And so now the alarm is raised. Not only that, but the fire becomes so hot that the guns on board and the powder that was left on board begins exploding, and the guns are going off. And so he and his men jump off and get back in their smaller ship and start to exit the harbor. And at this point, they're a target. Everybody knows, that they're the enemy. And so they are directing fire right at this little ship that's trying to get out of the harbor. But again, miraculously, providentially, they are unharmed and able, every one of them, not one lost that night. All of the men are able to get back to the ship, and they ensured the destruction of the Philadelphia and kept it out of the hands of the Tripolitans. This becomes world news. It's in all the newspapers all around the world, and Horatio Nelson, who's a very famous British naval officer, says it's the most daring act, of the day. So something, I'm not quoting him exactly correctly, but he gives high praise to this young Decatur. Decatur will go on to serve honorably in other action as well, and in other wars, and in a future action, which I'll tell you about in just a second. All right, let's fill in some blanks. They set fire to the ship. Protective hand of God was upon them. They were able to make their escape with only one injured man. So now the Americans are able to successfully blockade Tripoli, keep merchandise from coming in and out of the harbor, and they even were attacking her ships. They captured several gunboats. They killed some pirates. But the guy just wouldn't give up, and that's pretty typical. Okay? He will not submit. At this point, they come up with another daring plan. This one involves a little trickery, anyway, you'll see. Pasha Yusuf has a brother, so they get in touch with the brother, and they think they kind of offer a deal to the brother. Wouldn't you like to be the Pasha instead? They appeal to his power hungriness, and he goes for it. The brother longed to be in power, and in fact there's a backstory there about some pretty ill treatment by his brother. But anyway, an American force pledges to help this man, whose name is Hamet, gain the throne. If he promises, if we help you get on the throne, then you're going to play nice with the United States, right? You're going to end piracy. There'll be no more of this tribute paying if we help you come into power. So that was the deal that was struck, and Hamet took them up on it. And so a small force of 8 Marines, very small, y'all. But this is the Marine Corps, the United States Marine Corps, their first international mission. They were dispatched under the leadership of an American diplomat. They meet up with Hamet over here in Alexandria, because this is all super secret, right? So we're going to start marching. Hamet has raised a group of about 50 guys that'll go fight with him and try to take his brother out. Doesn't seem like nearly enough. Meanwhile, we have American ships out here in the Mediterranean, and at some point, they are planning to reinforce him and maybe add 100 more guys, 100 more Americans to the force. They trek across the desert. Things are very difficult. The account of the trip is pretty remarkable. They nearly starve to death. They nearly run out of water. They wound up having to eat a camel, one of their own camels, to survive and to make it to Dern. They're able to resupply like just before they get here, and they attack this city, which belongs to Pasha Yusuf. It's part of Tripoli. So they attack Dern, these 8 Marines, and the 50 guys that Hamet had raised. And I said, amazingly, this motley crew was able to capture the city of Dern, but they lost 14 men, and 2 of them were United States Marines. So these were our first 2 U.S. Marine casualties, and they were lost there on the Mediterranean coast, the North African coast, fighting Muslim terrorism. When the American flag flew over Dern, it represented the first foreign soil that had ever been captured by United States troops. And that is why, guys, when you hear the Marine hymn, which is from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, that's why it opens with that line. We will fight our country's battles on the air and land and sea, because one of the first battles was there on the shores of Tripoli. All right, Pasha Yusuf hears his brother is on the way, and he suddenly becomes anxious to work out a deal with the Americans. The American force There's some negotiating that happens, and we kind of sell out Hamad at the end of the day, and allowed Pasha Yusuf to stay on the throne with the understanding that he too would strike the same. If he wanted to stay on the throne, he was going to have to offer the same deal that his brother had. And so, yeah, the Americans leave Pasha Yusuf on the throne, or in control, but he agrees to release all the captives from the Philadelphia and to stop harassing American shipping. Hamet and the Marines sneak out of Dern. He becomes a refugee in America and go home. They all go home to America victorious. America had fought against piracy and Muslim terrorism, and we had won. This was huge back at home. This was the first really major military foray, and we had been successful, and we had stopped this terrible practice of paying bribes to Muslim terrorists on the northern coast of Africa. Still happens today, you guys. This is probably something, I won't get into this in great length, but this might be worth talking with your parents about. I'll also post a news article that ran back in 2014 when we traded, Bo Bergdahl had been captured, and the president at the time authorized a trade of 5 terrorists for our 1 military personnel. Not a good deal, and you don't negotiate with terrorists. And when you do so, you set yourself up, you put yourself in a position of weakness, and you set yourself up for more of the same. And so I'll post a little news story that ran at the time that kind of helps you understand that. When I originally put this slide presentation together, it was fresh in our minds. It was right in the news. And shortly after that, we had this incident where, again, it emboldens your enemy when you appear weak in their sight. And so we had a Muslim nation that actually pulled over one of our American boats and put all of our guys on, disarmed our military, put them on their knees, and shot video of it, and then distributed it around the world, where that never would have happened previous to this time period. All right, enough said about that. Also under Jefferson, the last thing I want to talk about, a major change that comes during his presidency, is the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. This is a pretty simple amendment, and it was simply to rectify the flaw that had been found in the Constitution regarding the election of our president and vice president. So y'all remember we had difficulty in 1796. We had a problem again in 1800, and it could be very easily solved. All we really had to do was say, hey, electors, when you cast your vote, put who you want for president and who you want for vice president, because clearly we're going to operate as a party system. It's not just going to be that the top 2 vote getters of all the wonderful people in America will be president and vice president. So it had become clear that we were going to be, partisan in our nation, and that the president and vice president then better be from the same party, or it was going to cause a lot of problems. So the 12th Amendment simply changed the verbiage constitutionally, indicating that you had to just simply note who you were choosing for president and who you were choosing for vice president. We call this the ticket today. We say you're voting for a ticket, meaning you're voting, you can't just vote for one guy for president and pick somebody else for vice president. You have to vote for the ticket that you're given. All right, let's fill in those blanks, but that's what I just explained. So faulty. Talk about the 1796 election, the 1800 election, and the solution was the 12th Amendment. And you had to specify your president and your vice president, and this established that you were voting for a presidential ticket. All right, guys, that's the end of our notes for this week. I want to quickly talk to you about your homework, because it's a little different. You do not have any kind of big written assignment unless you so choose this week. I'm going to have you watch the movie. I think it's only about 45 minutes, the Lewis and Clark, The Great Journey West film. So I want you to watch that. And then there's a couple journal excerpts from Meriwether Lewis that I'm going to post, and I would like you to read those aloud. And even better, if you have like a fire pit and you can like snack on some venison. But if you have a fire pit and you can sit outside with your family and just read those excerpts aloud, and then think about and talk about what that journey must have been like. I mean, talk about what you would have packed and how you think you would have fared in that same kind of a challenge. But also, after you've done the reading of the two excerpts, I want you to get creative. And guys, you can think outside the box, and you can email me if you want to do something entirely different than what I'm suggesting. But I'm going to post several suggestions for projects that you can do, creative projects. So that's all you have to do this week. Watch the movie, read aloud the journal excerpts, and then think outside the box and come up with a creative Lewis and Clark project. So, for example, you can, if you know a taxidermist, or there's one locally that you have access to, go talk to the taxidermist. Do a little homework ahead of time so you know what you're talking about, But ask them, how they think, what kind of preparation or what kind of materials would Lewis and Clark have used at the time? What would they use for stuffing? How would that have worked? What chemicals would they have needed to preserve the skins and that kind of thing? So go talk to a taxidermist and write a paragraph that tells kind of what you found out. Or research the tools that they use to determine their positioning and produce maps. And if you know a surveyor in town, go talk to the surveyor about those pieces of equipment. I would ask that surveyor if he knows how to use them. Like, do they even, or is it everything's so digital, would they even know how to use those old tools today? But see if that surveyor can explain to you a little bit about how Lewis and Clark would have found their longitude and latitude. Could be fun. You can, I'm going to post these to our website. Journal. Here's our story. Aren't these pretty? These are taken out of Meriwether Lewis's journals. I just love seeing him incorporate these wonderful sketches of the wildlife he's encountering with his descriptions. So you may copy one of these directly, or you can produce one of your own. I would love that. If you have a penchant for drawing, or even drawing, it doesn't have to be an animal. It can be a plant that you encounter. But guys, like maybe plan a short little hike, a 30-minute thing, and you've got a little state park or woods or something around you where you can get out in the woods a little bit. Be safe. Be safe. Okay. But if you can do that safely, I want you to go get out in the woods and see it with fresh eyes, and maybe create a journal page that mimics Lewis's. Or maybe you collect, if you're allowed to take things, collect 3 samples of items that you would have shipped back to Jefferson's, things that maybe he'd never seen before. But you have to not only collect them, but you need to describe what they are. And if they have Latin names or whatever, just, include and tag them, or like put them with a little descriptive tag, so that you have them like laid out on a table with these tags of how you would have shipped them back to Jefferson. And then once you've done that, guys, you need some kind of record for your notebook. So you'll have to take a picture of that, because you can't stick all, if it's an acorn or a tooth of something or whatever, you probably don't want to shove that in your notebook. So just take a picture of it once you've got it all laid out, what you would send to Jefferson. Or I think this is really cool too, and Lewis did this, where he would collect botanical samples, flowers and herbs and things like that, and press them. And so you can find that online and on Pinterest and wherever, like how to press not just flowers, but herbs and leaves and that kind of thing. So I would love that too. If you press it, it would take a couple days for you to get it nice and flat, and then just mount it on paper, maybe with wax paper over the top or whatever. I'm sure there's, again, instructions on Pinterest about how to do all that. But if you do a couple of those and then include those in your notebook, just do them on 8.5 by 11 paper so they'll slide into a page protector. But y'all notice down here at the bottom that there's description. So again, you can't like just go grab stuff and flatten it and stick it in your notebook. You need to do what Lewis did and provide a description, a scientific description. Find out what its Latin name is, describe like the root structure, how long the root structure is, the measurement, how wide the leaves are, what type of leaves they are, all that kind of thing. So give me, like a little 6-line description or something, written description of the plant that goes with it, if you're going to do that as your creative project. Gosh, there's so many things. You could look at herbs that they encountered. You could get into the music, and we know that they brought musical instruments. So if you wanted to even figure out a song that they played or a song from that period and you want to recreate it on a banjo or a harmonica or whatever, y'all think outside the box. And if you have a creative Lewis and Clark project that I haven't thought of, you feel free to be in touch and to do that this week. But that's it. So no big written thing, no questions and reading and all that to digest. So this is a brain break week, I hope. And I hope you'll enjoy it. And I will look forward to catching up with you next week when we move into Madison's presidency and some more excitement and some more miraculous interventions of God in history. All right, y'all. See you then.